So, Kat, let's just start with tell us what spread the vote is.
Sure. So, as you probably know, in 34 states across the country, voters require some form of identification in order to vote. And in 20 of those states, they require specific types of photo ID. But 21 million eligible voters in the country don't have government-issued photo ID. So Spread the Vote helps people get the IDs they need for voting. But also, as you know, you need photo ID for jobs, housing, medical care, all sorts of other things. So we get people the IDs that they need for life and for voting.
All right, before we get into how you actually execute that, let's talk a little bit about these 34 states that have voter ID laws. Is there a qualitative difference between the types of IDs that are required? What I mean, and I guess maybe even let's start with a more basic question. Why wouldn't why shouldn't we demand an ID for voting?
Because 21 million people don't have ID, and that shouldn't stop them from being able to vote. The justification that's used for these laws is voter fraud, but every reputable study on earth has told us that no, there aren't large buses of Mexicans going to the polls in funny hats and glasses and pretending that they have a different name so they can vote. It's not a thing that's happening. And so the real reason that voter ID laws exist is because they stop people, and the same people who are always targeted by these types of acts, from being able to vote: people of color, people with low incomes, the elderly, and students and young people. If you don't have an ID, then it shouldn't stop you from being able to attain your constitutionally given right of being able to vote. It's a poll tax, which is, there's a 24th Amendment. It's illegal, and it shouldn't be required. You should be able to vote.
Well, part of the problem is that there is no constitutionally guaranteed right to vote. There is only equal protection, right? So if there was a constitutionally guaranteed right to vote, anything that infringes upon it would be far more suspect. But the real question is are you treating everyone fairly in terms of how they have access to a vote? Well, let me ask you this. I just want to break this down, because I think part of the problem some people have is that it sounds like, oh, why wouldn't you show an ID? And you make the point that you have 21 million eligible voters in this country who don't have an ID, and we can go through some of those reasons in a moment. But the other part of it is just like, people need to stop and just think how hard it is to commit voter fraud in any meaningful way. We can joke about the idea of like busloads of Mexican nationals coming across the border and, then switching, I guess, into like, trying to adopt anglicized names and going and voting, presumably, but they would be spread around, right? The people don't walk through the process that would have to be involved to vote, to cast fraudulent votes in a meaningful way. It's sort of shocking in a way.
It is. I always just tell people to just, go through that exact thought exercise and really think about what voting looks like, and then how many people do you really think are going to go through that whole process? And we don't need a ton of studies, although we have a ton of studies that show us that this doesn't happen. But just really think about, what does it look like for someone, busloads and busloads of people, as has been, the talking point, who are really going to your neighborhood polling station and like pretending that there's some other person on the rolls. Like, if you just think logically about it for 5 seconds, you see how absurd the idea is.
And this is something else I think that people don't realize, is that it's not like this has been a long tradition in this country of showing an ID to vote, right? This is something that is 15 years old, maybe even less, in terms of like a strict voter ID.
Yeah, actually, it is less. So a few states, Indiana, Georgia, some states had sort of been testing this out and playing around with it in 2016, 6, 8, 7, 8, 9, and there were some early lawsuits and things like this. But it didn't really explode until the Supreme Court case Shelby County v. Holder, which took the teeth out of the Voting Rights Act. And so you have from about 2013 just all of these states who all of a sudden no longer have the protections of and requirements for changing sort of their voting regulations that were provided by the Voting Rights Act, who are able to pass all of these laws. So it's really just in the last few years that we're seeing this explosion of voter ID laws.
That I think is fascinating to keep in mind too. And just to be clear to people, I mean, just recount for folks like what changed about the Voting Rights Act that made it possible for all these states to sort of rush to impose these restrictions on voting.
Sure, I will try to refrain my inner lawyer geek. But essentially, one of the sections of the Voting Rights Act, Section 5, said that this list of states, and it was about sort of 12 states, I think, that had traditionally had incredibly suppressive voter laws, that anytime they wanted to change something about voting, and so whether it was requirements at the polls, whether it was gerrymandering, like all of these different things, that they had to seek something called pre-clearance from the Department of Justice. So they had to go to the Department of Justice and say, hey, we want to do this thing. And then the DOJ would evaluate it and usually say, no, you're insane, like you can't do that. It's extremely racist. What the Supreme Court did is they decided, led by our esteemed Chief Justice, that we had a Black president, so racism was clearly over. And so we no longer needed any sort of voting rights protection because the Black president equals equality for everyone forever. So they said, all right, well, we're going to take out the teeth that enforce Section 5, which is Section 2, super geeky policy stuff. But essentially they said, you no longer have to seek this sort of preclearance. You no longer have to go to the Department of Justice and get permission in order to change these your voting policies, your laws, et cetera. And so then states could do anything they wanted because there's no longer anybody there to have an eye over them and to enforce any sort of equality. And so they're just sort of running rampant.
And we should say, we should also note that what they did is they basically said the formula for pre-clearance was wrong. You could come up with a new one. Congress has yet to deal with that, surprisingly, right. Because Republicans have been in charge. And we should also remind people that the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized. I believe it was in 2007. And Antonin Scalia, in striking down that authorization and that element of the Voting Rights Act, found it fit to overrule essentially the legislature, despite the fact that this was a guy who always defers to the legislature, because he thought that they were too scared to vote against it, because it was, people don't like racism, I guess. Apparently. All right. Well, listen, Kat, we got to take a break. When we come back, I want to hear about what Spread the Vote does specifically, how they execute this mission of making sure that people have the right voter ID and that they actually get to vote. We got to take a quick break. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio.